What happens when a U.S. president gives Canada almost no room to negotiate, and Canada's prime minister decides the answer will not be surrender but defiance? And what if the next move could put the auto industry, electricity, steel, and the future of North American trade into the same fight? Before we break down what happened and why this confrontation suddenly became much bigger, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who follows U.S. Canada politics. Because this is not just another tariff story. It could become a turning point in the relationship between two of the most economically connected countries in the world. The latest confrontation did not come out of nowhere. It arrived after days of negotiations, failed promises, rising tariffs, and growing frustration on both sides of the border. But what made this moment different was the language coming from Ottawa. Mark Carney was no longer talking like a leader trying to keep an uncomfortable relationship calm at all costs. He was talking like a leader drawing a line. And that line was simple. Canada would negotiate with the United States, but Canada would not accept a deal that treated Canadian industry as permanently inferior to American industry. That distinction matters because the dispute is no longer only about the size of a tariff. It is becoming a fight over what the economic relationship between Canada and the United States is supposed to look like. For decades, the two economies have been deeply connected. Cars and parts cross the border repeatedly during production. Steel moves between factories. Electricity flows from Canadian provinces into American states. Dairy products, machinery, appliances, electronics, and countless other goods depend on the same cross-border system. That integration created enormous benefits, but it also created something else, dependence. And Washington increasingly appears willing to use that dependence as leverage. The latest threat targeted one of the most important parts of Canada's economy, automobiles. The warning was that tariffs on Canadian cars, trucks, auto parts, and steel could rise to 50% beginning January 1st, 2027. That is not a small adjustment. For an industry built around supply chains that cross the border again and again, a tariff of that size can completely change the economics of production. A vehicle can begin its journey in one country, move across the border for components, return for assembly, and cross the border again before reaching the customer. Now imagine putting a 50% barrier into that system. Suddenly, decisions that once made economic sense may no longer make sense. Factories have to reconsider investment. Suppliers have to reconsider contracts. Workers have to wonder whether production will stay where it is. And companies have to make long-term decisions while knowing the political situation could change again tomorrow. That uncertainty may be just as damaging as the tariff itself. But the biggest surprise was not Trump's threat. It was Carney's response. Instead of immediately trying to calm the situation, Carney made it clear that Canada would not accept an arrangement in which its industries were expected to permanently take a back seat to American industries. He argued that the United States was asking for far more than it was prepared to give in return. And that statement reveals the central problem. Both governments believe they were the side making reasonable demands. Both believe the other side pushed too far. And both now have political reasons to avoid appearing weak. That makes compromise much harder. The breakdown happened after Canada had already prepared to make concessions. Carney's government was reportedly ready to remove remaining retaliatory tariffs on American steel, aluminum, and cars. Canada was also prepared to pressure provinces to return American liquor to store shelves. Those were meaningful concessions, but according to Carney, Washington's final demands went too far. From Canada's perspective, the problem was not simply that the United States wanted better access to Canadian markets. The problem was the structure of the proposed relationship. If Canadian companies could only remain competitive by accepting permanent disadvantages compared with American companies, Carney was not willing to sign. That is where the argument became much more fundamental. This was no longer simply a negotiation over numbers. It was about sovereignty. It was about industrial policy. And it was about whether Canada would remain a genuine manufacturing partner of the United States or gradually become an economy whose most important industries were shaped by decisions made in Washington. The American side has a very different explanation. U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer argued that Washington had offered Canada the best deal it had offered to any country. He accused Canada of introducing new demands and reversing concessions near the end of negotiations. And then came an especially important argument from Greer. He pointed to the 1960s Auto Pact and suggested that Canada's automobile industry exists partly because of an arrangement in which Canada provided market access to American manufacturers in exchange for production being located north of the border. That argument changes the entire political meaning of the dispute. To Washington, the history can be presented as evidence that Canada's auto industry benefited from access to the American market. To Ottawa, the same history can be viewed completely differently. Canada did not simply receive a favor. Canada became part of a shared manufacturing system. Factories, suppliers, workers, and investments developed on both sides of the border. That system became valuable precisely because it was integrated. So when Washington now talks about Canadian production as something that exists because of American generosity, Canadian officials hear something much more serious. They hear a challenge to the basic idea of partnership. And that helps explain why Carney reacted so strongly. He was not simply defending a tariff rate, he was defending Canada's place in the manufacturing relationship. Then Ontario Premier Doug Ford entered the confrontation, and the language became even more explosive. Ford did something rarely. Seen in relations between the United States and Canada, he directly challenged the American president in extremely blunt terms. He warned that Ontario had its own tools available if Washington continued escalating. One of the most important tools is electricity. Ontario supplies electricity to American customers in Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. Roughly 1.5 million American homes and businesses are connected to that power supply, and Ford has already demonstrated that electricity exports can become part of a trade confrontation. During an earlier escalation, Ontario imposed a 25% surcharge on electricity exports. Washington responded with another tariff threat. That created a dangerous cycle. Washington increases economic pressure. Canada responds. Ontario adds pressure through electricity. Washington threatens more tariffs. And the cycle begins again. This is important because electricity is different from many other products. A tariff on a physical product can sometimes be absorbed, rerouted, or replaced by another supplier. Electricity is harder. Power networks are physical systems. They depend on infrastructure, transmission capacity, timing, and regional demand. That makes electricity a potentially powerful bargaining tool. But Ford's position also reveals something complicated about Canada's response. Canada may be united against the idea of being economically dominated by Washington, but Canadian politicians do not necessarily agree on every concession. Ford himself revealed that he had opposed the preliminary deal being considered by Carney's government before the talks collapsed. His objection involved American alcohol returning to Ontario shelves. That means Carney was fighting on two fronts. He had Washington demanding more. And inside Canada, provincial leaders were warning him not to give away too much. That makes the negotiations even harder. A prime minister can negotiate a deal internationally, but that deal still has to survive politically at home. And right now, Canada's political environment appears increasingly hostile to any agreement that looks like surrender. Trump's response to Ford made the dispute even more personal. Rather than simply answering Ford's economic argument, Trump attacked him personally and compared him unfavorably with Ford's late brother, former Toronto Mayor Rob Ford. That may seem like a side issue. It is not. Personal attacks change the atmosphere around negotiations. Once leaders begin attacking one another publicly, every compromise becomes harder. A negotiator can privately accept a difficult economic concession. It is much harder for a government to accept that concession after its opponent has publicly insulted its leaders. Political pride becomes part of the negotiation. And that is exactly what makes the current confrontation so dangerous. The economic relationship between Canada and the United States is too large to treat as a normal political argument. Canada is one of America's largest trading partners. More than $380 billion in goods crossed the border in 2025. The automobile industry sits at the center of that relationship. Steel sits at the center. Energy sits at the center. And because supply chains are so integrated, a disruption on one side can quickly become a problem on the other. A tariff may be announced as punishment for Canada, but the economic consequences do not stop at the Canadian border. Tariffs are collected from importers. That means American companies importing Canadian goods are the ones paying the duties when those goods enter the United States. Those companies can then pass some or all of those costs along the supply chain. Eventually, the cost can reach consumers. That means an American tariff designed to pressure Canada can also become a cost for American businesses and households. A Canadian auto part becomes more expensive. An American manufacturer using that part faces higher costs. A vehicle becomes more expensive to produce. The consumer eventually sees the impact. And that is why the auto industry is so sensitive. The system was designed around efficiency. The tariff system introduces friction. And the higher the tariff, the greater the pressure to redesign the entire supply chain. If you are enjoying this breakdown, this is a good moment to support the channel. Hit like, subscribe if you want more clear analysis of major political and economic confrontations, and share this video with someone who wants the story behind the headlines, not just the headlines themselves. Now consider the timing. The 50% threat did not arrive months after the negotiations collapsed. It arrived almost immediately. The earlier tariff dispute had already moved into a new phase. Canada's 50% retaliatory measures were scheduled to begin September 8th, covering products such as steel, dairy, appliances, farm equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics. So businesses were already dealing with uncertainty. Then another major threat appeared. And this one had a future deadline, January 1st, 2027. That creates a strange situation. Companies have time to prepare, but they do not have certainty. They know a potentially massive tariff could arrive. They also know negotiations could restart. They know the policy could change. They know another escalation could happen. And they know political statements can change extremely quickly. For a company planning a factory that could operate for 20 or 30 years, that uncertainty is enormous. Should it invest in Canada? Should it expand in the United States? Should it move production? Should it wait? Should it sign long-term contracts? Should it redesign its supply chain? These are not political questions for executives. They are financial questions. And every new threat makes those questions harder to answer. The Canadian auto industry therefore faces a problem that goes beyond today's tariff rate. It faces a question about whether companies can trust the cross-border manufacturing model in the future. For decades, the assumption was that North American integration would continue. Factories were built around that assumption. Suppliers were organized around it. Workers were trained around it. Transportation networks were designed around it. If that assumption disappears, the entire structure has to be reconsidered. And rebuilding supply chains is not something that happens overnight. That is why the 16-month runway attached to the proposed 2027 tariff is so important. There is time for diplomacy, but there is also time for companies to begin preparing for a world in which the tariff becomes permanent. That creates pressure on both governments. Washington can use the threat as leverage. Ottawa can use the threat as a reason to diversify. And companies can quietly start preparing for both outcomes. There's another part of the dispute that receives less attention: dairy. Canadian dairy exports to the United States are worth hundreds of millions of dollars each year. Products such as milk, cheese, butter, and whey remain part of the broader conflict. Alcohol is another unresolved issue. Canadian provinces removed American liquor from shelves early in the dispute. Some restrictions remain, and Ford's refusal to reverse Ontario's position shows how political these economic measures have become. A bottle of American liquor may seem insignificant compared with a car factory, but politically, it represents something larger. It becomes a symbol of whether Canada is willing to make concessions, while Washington is demanding more. Every individual issue becomes connected to the larger argument. Steel, cars, dairy, liquor, electricity, oil, potash, each becomes another piece on the negotiating board. And the more pieces that are involved, the harder it becomes to find a simple solution. Underneath all of this is an even bigger question. What happens to the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement? USMCA was designed to create a stable framework for trade across North America. But the current dispute is increasingly challenging the assumptions behind that stability. Washington declined to simply renew the agreement as it stood and moved toward a process involving rolling annual reviews. That creates a very different environment. Businesses once had a framework they could plan around. Now they face repeated moments of uncertainty. And Canada has another concern. Mexico is continuing along its own path with Washington. If Mexico manages to advance its trade relationship with the United States, while Canada remains locked in a bilateral confrontation, Canada could eventually find itself in a weaker position inside the broader North American system. That possibility is one reason the current dispute matters far beyond Canada. It could reshape the entire structure of North American trade. There is also a legal question surrounding the tariff strategy. The administration revived Section 338 of the 1930 Tariff Act. That provision had been unused for decades. In fact, it had not been used to impose tariffs by an American president since 1949. Its revival came after the Supreme Court struck down Trump's broader emergency powers tariff authority in February 2026. Trade lawyers questioned whether Section 338 remained a strong legal foundation, arguing that later trade laws may have superseded parts of it. That uncertainty matters because a tariff threat is only as durable as the legal authority supporting it. If businesses know a tariff can be challenged, that changes their calculations. If governments know the legal foundation is uncertain, that changes negotiations. And if the administration tries to maintain a major tariff regime for years, the legal battle could become just as important as the economic battle. Then there is history. Section 338 comes from the same Depression-era law associated with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. That law remains one of the most famous examples of protectionist trade policy, producing consequences far beyond its original intentions. More than 1,000 economists warned President Hoover against signing it. He signed it anyway. Global trade later collapsed dramatically during the Great Depression. That does not mean today's situation will repeat the 1930s. The world economy is different. The institutions are different. The industries are different. But the historical lesson remains important. Trade wars rarely stay limited to the original target. Once one side imposes a barrier, the other side has an incentive to respond. Then the first side responds again. And suddenly, both governments are defending measures that neither expected to need when the dispute began. That is the danger Canada and the United States now face. Each new action creates a political reason for another response, and each response makes the next compromise more difficult. The financial markets have already reacted to the uncertainty. The Canadian dollar came under additional pressure after the latest escalation. Investors are not simply asking whether tariffs will exist. They are asking how long they will last. They are asking whether the relationship can return to normal. They are asking whether Canadian companies will remain competitive. And they are asking whether North America's integrated production system can survive repeated political shocks. Those questions affect investment. Investment affects jobs. Jobs affect politics. Politics then affects the next round of negotiations. The cycle can reinforce itself. And that may be the most important point in this entire story. The dispute is no longer only about what Trump wants, it is also about what Canada is willing to accept. Carney has now established a clear condition for returning to negotiations. Washington would need to change its approach toward Canadian industry. Canada would not return to the table simply to accept a framework in which its companies are structurally disadvantaged. That gives Ottawa a strong negotiating position in one sense. Everyone knows where Canada stands. But it also creates a challenge. If Carney has drawn such a clear line, moving away from it later could look like weakness. Washington faces the same problem. Trump has made the tariff threats public. He has attacked Canadian leaders publicly. If he suddenly reduces the tariffs without a visible concession from Canada, his political opponents could describe the move as backing down. That is how trade disputes become trapped. The economic logic may favor compromise. The political logic may punish it. And when those two forces collide, negotiations can become much longer than anyone expects. Canada's provincial leaders understand this. That is why their reaction matters. Manitoba's premier has backed Carney's approach. Ontario has taken a particularly aggressive stance. Other provinces have echoed support. The federal government is also preparing support for small and medium-sized businesses and provinces expected to suffer heavily from the dispute. That suggests Ottawa is not assuming the confrontation will disappear quickly. It is preparing for economic pain, and that preparation itself sends a message. Canada is signaling that it intends to withstand pressure rather than immediately surrender to it. But there is a major risk. Economic pain does not respect political borders. Canadian workers can lose opportunities. American manufacturers can face higher costs. Consumers can pay more. Investors can delay projects. Businesses can move production. And entire communities can feel the impact. That means neither country can truly win if the confrontation becomes permanent. The question is, which side believes the other will suffer? Or first, Washington appears to believe Canada's dependence on the American market gives the United States overwhelming leverage. Canada is now testing that assumption. Ottawa is effectively saying, yes, Canada needs access to the American market, but America also benefits enormously from Canada. That is why electricity matters. That is why auto parts matter. That is why Canadian steel matters. That is why energy matters. The relationship is not one-directional. It is interconnected. And when two deeply connected economies start using that interdependence as a weapon, both sides become vulnerable. That is what makes Carney's response so significant. He's not claiming Canada does not need America. He's arguing that needing a partner does not mean accepting permanent subordination to that partner. That is a very different position. It is also a much harder one to negotiate, because now the argument is about respect as much as economics. And once respect enters the conversation, numbers alone may not solve the problem. So what happens next? There are several possible paths. The first is a return to negotiations. If Washington changes its demands and Canada finds a way to offer enough concessions without sacrificing its industrial priorities, the crisis could still be contained. The second is prolonged economic pressure. The tariffs remain. Canada's retaliation takes effect. Businesses adjust, and both governments wait to see which side feels the pain first. The third path is escalation. More tariffs, more Canadian retaliation, more pressure on electricity, energy, and other sectors. And if personal attacks continue, the political atmosphere could become even harder to repair. The fourth path may happen quietly. Companies themselves could begin redesigning supply chains. They may decide that the era of assuming stable cross-border trade is over. Even if governments eventually reach a deal, businesses may remember what happened. That memory can influence investment for years, and that could be the most lasting consequence of this confrontation. Not one tariff, not one presidential statement, but a change in how companies think about North American economic integration. For generations, the border between Canada and the United States was treated as an economic connection rather than a major obstacle. If repeated tariff threats turn that border back into a major business risk, the relationship could change even without a formal end to USMCA. And that is why this story deserves more attention than the latest political insult. The real question is not who won one argument. The real question is whether the economic model that Connected Canada and the United States for decades can survive a period in which both governments are increasingly willing to use that connection against each other. Trump has made his position clear. Pressure is his negotiating tool. Carney has now made Canada's position clear as well. Pressure will not automatically produce surrender. And Doug Ford has demonstrated that Canada's provinces may have their own weapons if the confrontation continues. That creates a completely different negotiation environment from the one Washington may have expected. The United States still has enormous economic power. Canada still depends heavily on access to the American market. But Canada is beginning to demonstrate that dependence does not mean helplessness. Electricity can be used as leverage. Retaliatory tariffs can be used. Political unity can be used. And perhaps most importantly, Canada can begin looking for ways to reduce the risks created by relying so heavily on one market. Whether those tools are strong enough to force Washington to change course remains uncertain, but the fact that Ottawa is willing to use them changes the calculation. And there is one final reason this moment matters. The dispute has moved incredibly quickly. It went from negotiations to collapse, from collapse to 50% tariffs, from tariffs to retaliation, from retaliation to a new threat against automobiles and steel, and from economic disagreement to personal attacks between senior political leaders. Every step makes the next step easier. That is the danger. Once governments become accustomed to escalation, the original dispute can become almost secondary. The political battle becomes about proving who can stand firm. And when that happens, compromise begins to look like defeat. For Canada, Carney's out. The message is that sovereignty and industrial survival are not bargaining chips. For Washington, the argument is that America should not have to accept trade arrangements it considers unfair. Both sides believe they are defending their own national interests, and that is precisely why this confrontation may not disappear quickly. The next few months will reveal whether this is ultimately a temporary crisis or the beginning of a much deeper transformation. Will Washington return with a different offer? Will Ottawa maintain its red lines? Will Ontario actually use electricity as leverage if the pressure increases? Will businesses begin moving investment? Will the auto industry prepare for a 50% tariff that may never arrive? And perhaps the biggest question of all, can two countries that depend so heavily on each other continue treating economic interdependence as a weapon without eventually hurting themselves? The answer will not be decided by one speech or one social media post. It will be decided by factories, workers, consumers, investors, provincial governments, and negotiators on both sides of the border. What began as a trade disagreement is now becoming a test of the entire North American economic relationship. And Carney's response made one thing unmistakably clear. Canada is still willing to negotiate, but Canada is no longer willing to negotiate from the assumption that it must accept whatever Washington demands. That may be the real shock Washington did not expect. The United States can threaten tariffs. Canada can retaliate. But neither country can completely escape the other. They are connected by roads, railways, factories, pipelines, power lines, workers, consumers, and decades of shared economic history. Breaking that connection would be expensive. Maintaining it through constant threats may also become expensive. So the real battle is not simply about who blinks first. It is about whether both governments can recognize that economic power works differently when the target is also your partner. The coming months will test that idea. And if the current trajectory continues, January 4th, 2027 may not be the beginning of the crisis. It could simply be the date by which the consequences of today's decisions finally become impossible to ignore. If you want to understand what happens next, keep watching this story closely, because the next move from Washington or Ottawa could determine whether this becomes a temporary tariff fight or the beginning of a completely different Canada-US relationship.